Right now, buried under the sand you are looking at, there are whales with legs. There are entire cities with running water and irrigation systems that rival anything the Romans ever built. There is a cemetery older than the pyramids, where a mother is still holding her 2 children in an embrace that has lasted 5,000 years. And none of it, not a single piece of it, was supposed to be there. The Sahara Desert is 3.5 million square miles of nothing. That is what we were told. That is what every textbook says. But over the last 25 years, researchers with satellite radar and shovels have been pulling things out of that sand that are forcing us to rethink everything we thought we knew about this place, about the people who lived here, and about how fast the world we stand on can completely transform into something unrecognizable. So let me tell you what they actually found, because honestly, once you hear this, you will never look at a picture of the Sahara the same way again. It starts in the year 2000, in a part of the Sahara so brutal it has its own name, the Sahara Desert in Niger. Often called a desert within a desert, the Sahara is one of the most lifeless places on Earth. The temperature regularly pushes past 120 degrees. Sandstorms blow in without warning. The government of Niger will not let you enter without an armed military escort because of bandits. Into this wasteland drove a paleontologist named Paul Sereno from the University of Chicago. He was looking for dinosaur bones. His team was running out of daylight. They were miles from base camp, and Sereno was about to turn the convoy around when someone in his vehicle spotted something dark sticking out of the sand. He stopped. Within minutes, every person on the team was standing still, staring at the ground. There were bones everywhere. Skulls half buried in the dunes, ribs poking through the surface, hands reaching out of the earth like the dead were trying to climb free. But these were not dinosaur bones. These were human. And scattered around them were things that made no sense at all. Fish hooks, harpoon tips carved from animal bone, the skeletal remains of 6-foot-long Nile perch, hippopotamuses, and crocodiles. Every single clue pointed to one impossible conclusion. These people had not died in a desert. They had lived on the shore of a lake. Let that sit for a second. Hippos in the Sahara. Crocodiles and giant freshwater fish in a place where it does not rain for years at a time. That site is called Gobero, and what it gave up over the next 2 decades of excavation is one of the most staggering archaeological stories of our lifetime. The team eventually uncovered more than 200 burial sites spread across ancient sand dunes. Radiocarbon dating placed the oldest remains at nearly 10,000 years old, which means these people were living and dying here 5,000 years before the first Egyptian pyramid was even a thought. And here is where it gets strange. The burials belong to 2 completely different groups of people, separated by more than 1,000 years of time. Yet they were buried side by side in the same cemetery on the same dunes, as if this one spot kept pulling people back across millennia. The older group, called the Kiphians, were giants. Some of their skeletons measured over 6'8". Analysis of their thigh bones showed massive muscle ridges, which told researchers these were powerful, heavily muscled people who hunted large game and hauled enormous fish out of deep water. The younger group, the Tenarians, were leaner and more refined. They herded cattle, used sophisticated hunting tools, and buried their dead with jewelry, including a young girl found still wearing a bracelet carved from the tusk of a hippo. But the burial that shut the entire 2006 expedition down was something nobody on the team had ever encountered. Lying on her side in the sand was the skeleton of a small woman. Facing her were two children, about 5 and 7 years old. The younger child was clinging to the older one, a tiny arm draped across the other child's neck. The woman's right arm curled under the older child's head like a pillow. Her left hand reached across and clasped the 5-year-old's. They had been placed together in an embrace that had not moved in over 5,000 years. When the team carefully cleared the sand beneath the skeletons, they found something that hit even harder: pollen clusters. These 3 people had been laid to rest on a bed of flowers. 4 arrowheads had been placed in the grave, arranged with obvious care. Whatever happened to this family, someone loved them enough to make their goodbye beautiful. Paul Sereno later said this moment brought his team to tears, and if it does not get to you even a little, I do not know what will. Because this was not some crude prehistoric ritual. This was grief. This was tenderness. This was a family being put to rest by someone whose heart was broken, and they did it in a place that is now one of the most desolate stretches of sand on the planet. So how does any of this make sense? How are there hippos and crocodiles and a 10,000-year-old cemetery with flowers in it sitting in the middle of the deadliest desert on Earth? And this is the part of the story where everything flips. The Sahara has not always been a desert, not even close. It flips back and forth between scorching wasteland and lush green paradise roughly every 20,000 years, driven by a wobble in the Earth's axis that shifts the African monsoon belt northward. The most recent green period started about 12,000 years ago and ended roughly 5,000 years ago. And during that window, the Sahara was completely unrecognizable. We are not talking about a few scattered oases. We are talking about a full-blown ecosystem the size of the continental United States. Satellite radar has revealed the ghosts of massive river systems buried under the sand, including one called the Tamanrasset, whose drainage basin was so enormous it would rank as the 12th largest on Earth today if it were still flowing. Lake Chad, which right now is barely a puddle compared to what it used to be, swelled during this period to a size larger than all 5 of the North American Great Lakes combined. Rock art across Algeria, Libya, and Niger shows people swimming, fishing from canoes, and herding cattle through grasslands where giraffes, elephants, warthogs, and pythons all roamed freely. The Sahara was the Serengeti. And then, in what amounts to a geological blink, it all dried up and vanished. Now, if you think that is the wildest part of this story, stay with me, because we are just getting started. What happened next is something that should not have been possible. After the Green Sahara died and the rivers turned to dust and the lakes evaporated into nothing, most people left. They migrated toward the Nile, where many researchers believe they contributed to the rise of Egyptian civilization. But in one remote corner of the desert, in what is now southwestern Libya, a group of people decided to stay. Not just stay, they built an empire. In the middle of the driest, hottest, most water-starved environment on the planet. And they pulled it off for 800 years. They were called the Garamantes, and for centuries the world had them completely wrong. Greek and Roman historians dismissed them as barbarians. Herodotus described them as chariot-riding raiders who hunted people across the sand. That was the official story for 2,000 years. Then, in the early 2000s, archaeologist David Mattingly from the University of Leicester started studying satellite photographs of the Fezzan region in Libya. What he found was not scattered campsites or nomad shelters. He found over 100 fortified settlements. Walled towns with straight-line construction so precise that researchers initially mistook them for Roman military forts. But these were not Roman. These were 600 miles south of Tripoli, deep in the interior of the Sahara, built by an African civilization that mainstream history had written off as savages.
Here is how they did it. And honestly, this is the part that keeps me up at night. Beneath the Fezzan region sits one of the largest sandstone aquifers in the world, filled with fossil water that had been sealed underground since the days of the Green Sahara. The Garamantes figured out it was down there, and they figured out how to get it. They used a technology called Fagara, a system of gently sloping underground tunnels that tapped into the water table and channeled groundwater downhill into irrigation networks using nothing but gravity. No pumps, no machinery, just angles, physics, and an insane amount of manual labor. The numbers are hard to wrap your head around. Archaeologists have mapped over 750 kilometers of these underground tunnels across the Fezzan, serviced by roughly 100,000 vertical access shafts, each dug by hand, some dropping over 130 feet straight down into the earth. The tunnels themselves were narrow, about 2 feet wide and 5 feet tall, stretching for miles through sand, gravel, clay, and solid rock. Ohio State University researchers calculated that building this system required at least 77,000 man-years of labor, and that does not include the wells or any maintenance. Think about what that means. That is a construction effort on the scale of the greatest engineering feats of the ancient world, and the Garamantes did it under the Saharan sun with hand tools, no blueprints, and zero margin for error, because if they got the angles wrong, no water would flow, and everyone would die. And it worked. It worked for 8 centuries. Their capital, Garama, may have supported a population of 50,000 people at its peak. They grew wheat, barley, figs, grapes, sorghum, and dates in the middle of a place where nothing grows today. They traded across the entire Sahara, linking the Mediterranean to sub-Saharan Africa, along routes that moved gold, salt, and goods across thousands of miles of open desert. They had a written language. They built pyramid-shaped tombs. They fielded armies of chariots and cavalry and ruled an empire covering 70,000 square miles. A hydrogeologist at Ohio State named Frank Schwartz studied their water system and said something that sums up the whole story perfectly. He said, "It should not have worked." The fact that the aquifer was positioned where it was, at exactly the right depth and elevation for the Fagara tunnels to tap into it, was pure geological luck. But the Garamantes had the intelligence and the engineering skill to take that luck and turn it into a civilization. And then the luck ran out. Fossil water does not recharge. Once you pump it, it is gone forever. Sometime around the 4th or 5th century, the water table dropped below the tunnels. The Fagara stopped flowing. The farms turned to dust. And one of the most brilliant civilizations in human history went silent, so thoroughly buried by the sand that the world forgot they ever existed for 1,500 years. But the Sahara is not done with us yet. About 150 kilometers southwest of Cairo, in a stretch of Egypt's western desert where absolutely nothing lives, sits a valley that tells a story so old it makes the Garamantes look like they showed up yesterday. It is called Wadi al-Hitan, the Valley of the Whales. In 1902, a geologist stumbled across massive bones jutting out of the desert floor and had no idea what he was looking at. It took decades and multiple expeditions before anyone fully understood. Spread across nearly 80 square miles of open sand are the fossilized skeletons of more than 400 ancient whales. Not the whales we know today, but their ancestors, creatures called Basilosaurus and Dorodon that swam through a warm, shallow sea covering this entire region roughly 40 million years ago. Some of these skeletons stretch over 60 feet long. And here is the detail that will genuinely mess with your head. Some of them still have legs. small vestigial hind limbs with feet and toes, preserved in stone. Physical proof that these animals were in the middle of evolving from creatures that walked on land into the ocean giants we know today. One fully intact specimen was found with the remains of crabs, sawfish, and a smaller whale species still sitting in the cavity where its stomach used to be. A 40-million-year-old lunch, frozen in time.
Let me just make sure you are tracking what I just said. There are whale skeletons with feet in the Sahara Desert. Whales that used to walk, buried in sand where the temperature hits 130 degrees and nothing has lived for thousands of years. This site is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized as the single most important location on Earth for understanding how whales transitioned from land to sea. The fossils are surrounded by the remains of sharks, crocodiles, sea turtles, and rays, painting a complete snapshot of an underwater world that once thrived here, when this part of Africa was submerged beneath the ancient Tethys Sea. Then tectonic forces lifted the ocean floor. The sea retreated north. The water disappeared. And these giants that once ruled a tropical ocean were sealed in sediment and left to bake under the sun for 40 million years, until the desert wind finally stripped the sand away and showed them to us. And if that is not enough to make you question everything you were taught about this part of the world, I have one more. In the remote Adrar Plateau of Mauritania, far from any city or road, sits something so enormous that nobody on the ground even knew it existed until astronauts spotted it from orbit during the Gemini missions in the 1960s. It is called the Richat structure, but most people know it as the Eye of the Sahara. From space, it looks like a perfect bullseye stamped into the desert, a series of concentric rings stretching roughly 25 miles across. Scientists initially assumed a meteorite had carved it out, but when they tested the rock, there was no impact evidence at all. No melted minerals, no shock fractures. What they found instead were layers of sedimentary rock pushed upward by a dome of magma from deep underground roughly 100 million years ago, then carved into rings by eons of wind and water erosion. The geology alone is fascinating, but in 2018, a theory exploded across the internet that turned this formation into one of the most debated locations on Earth. The theory claimed the Richat structure is the lost city of Atlantis. And before you roll your eyes, hear out why millions of people took it seriously.
Plato described Atlantis as a circular city built in alternating rings of land and water with a diameter of roughly 23 kilometers. The Richat structure's inner rings measure approximately 23.5 kilometers. Plato placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar. The Richat structure sits directly south of that strait. Plato described mountains to the north. The Adrar Plateau rises to the north. He described a vast flat plain to the south. Satellite imagery shows exactly that, a nearly level floodplain stretching hundreds of kilometers toward the Niger River. The alignment is eerie. But here is what the evidence actually says. There is zero archaeological proof that anyone ever built a city at the Richat structure. No pottery, no foundations, no tools, nothing. The formation itself is 100 million years old, created by geological forces that existed tens of millions of years before humans walked the Earth. And while the Sahara was certainly greener in the past, it was never submerged beneath the Atlantic Ocean during any period of human existence. The salt deposits within the rings, which theorists point to as evidence of seawater, are far more likely the result of groundwater evaporation over geological time. Most scholars consider Atlantis a philosophical allegory invented by Plato, not an actual place. But here is why I am telling you about it anyway. The reason the Atlantis theory captured so many people is not because the evidence is convincing. It is because the Sahara has already proven, over and over and over again, that it is hiding things nobody expected. Every time someone aims a satellite at this desert or sticks a shovel into the sand, something impossible shows up. Rivers bigger than the Ganges, cities that lasted 8 centuries on prehistoric water,
a 10,000-year-old graveyard where a mother is still holding her children. Whale skeletons with toes. The Sahara has trained us to believe that anything could be under there. And the terrifying thing is that the real discoveries are more extraordinary than Atlantis ever could be, because they are actually real.
And we are nowhere close to done finding things. In 2010, geologists from the Smithsonian published evidence of a prehistoric megalake in the eastern Sahara that once covered more than 42,000 square miles. It formed when the Nile overflowed through a low channel near Wadi Tushka, roughly 250,000 years ago, flooding the desert with water that extended over 250 miles west of the river. Fossil fish found at elevations of 800 feet above sea level helped researchers calculate its size, and the locations of ancient human camps discovered nearby matched the projected shoreline almost perfectly. Think about the scale of that. A lake bigger than the entire state of Virginia sitting in the Sahara 250,000 years ago. The people camped on its shores were not farmers or city builders. They were among the earliest modern humans to walk the earth, and they were drawn to this place because it was not a wasteland. It was a paradise. The Sahara was not where people went to die. It was where they went to live. And in 2025, the desert handed us something that rewrote human genetics. Researchers extracted ancient DNA from 2 women buried 7,000 years ago in a rock shelter called Takarkori in southwestern Libya. The results revealed a genetic lineage that had been isolated in North Africa for roughly 50,000 years, a population that split off from the rest of humanity around the time of the Great Migration out of Africa, and then just stayed. They stayed in the Green Sahara, hidden, mixing with almost no one for tens of thousands of years, while the rest of humanity spread across the globe. Their genetic fingerprint is still detectable in modern North Africans today, a ghost signal from an entire people we did not even know existed until the desert finally gave up their bones.
Ground-penetrating radar is still peeling back layers that no one has seen. Japanese and European space agencies have mapped an entire ancient river network beneath the Western Sahara, and the main channel last flowed only 6,500 years ago, which means the shift from green paradise to barren wasteland happened with terrifying speed. NASA shuttle radar has traced ancient trade routes and buried settlements invisible on the surface, but perfectly preserved beneath a few feet of dry sand. AI-enhanced synthetic aperture radar is now being used to detect metallic artifacts and structural remains beneath desert floors across North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula without ever breaking ground. In 2025, researchers using this technology uncovered traces of 5,000-year-old settlements in the Dubai Desert, and similar scans across the Sahara are expected to reveal far more. The Fezzan region, where the Garamantes built their empire, remains largely unexplored due to political instability in Libya. Vast stretches of the Western Sahara are still archaeologically blank, not because nothing is there, but because no one has been able to safely survey them. There are almost certainly more Goberos buried out there, more forgotten kingdoms, more graveyards full of people whose stories have never been told.
The Sahara is not empty. It never was. It is a museum sealed under sand, holding the remains of worlds we have barely started to understand. Every grain of sand in every photograph you have ever seen of this place is sitting on top of something. A riverbed that carried water bigger than the Ganges. A lakeshore where families fished and swam and buried their dead with flowers. A tunnel dug by hand 100 feet underground so that a civilization could drink water that fell as rain 10,000 years before they were born. A whale skeleton with legs and feet and toes, resting in a spot where the ocean used to be. The desert did not destroy these things. It preserved them. It sealed them in the driest, most airless environment on the planet, where nothing decays, nothing rots, and nothing is truly gone.
That is what they found under the Sahara, and it changes everything. Not just about this desert,
but about how we think about the ground beneath our feet anywhere on this planet. Because if the Sahara, the most studied, most photographed, most familiar desert on Earth, can hide whales and empires and rivers and civilizations and a mother holding her children for 5,000 years, then what else is under there? What else is under all of it? The answer, based on everything that has been dug up so far, is more than we can possibly imagine. And we have only just barely scratched the surface. The next time someone shows you a picture of the Sahara and you see nothing but sand, remember what is underneath. An ocean floor, a green paradise, an empire that drank the last drop of ancient water before disappearing into the dust, a graveyard where the dead are still reaching for each other. All of it real, all of it documented, all of it hidden right beneath our feet this entire time. And the sand is still shifting.